interesting that today we have the cross of the laws, and the cross of the laws is a fascinating incarnation cross. And the gates, the 60 and the 56 and the 3 and the 50, each and every one of those gates represent fundamental aspects of the laws of the Maya. And it's interesting when you look, or you take the perspective of looking at these laws within the context of the mystical, spiritual process. There are laws. It's like that wonderful law that says, never ask why me. There are certain laws that if you cross those boundaries, if you break those laws, there's a great deal of suffering waiting. And it's interesting that, for example, if you look at let's begin with the 50th gate, and to really understand something about the nature of intelligence, that everything is about finding a way at the highest level of awareness. After all, the 50th gate is the source of what we call intelligence, whether that be instinctive, intuitive, or judgmental. And everything about the 50th gate is to find a specific strategy. The whole nature of practical human design, the practical application of giving people their strategy, this is what the goal of our intelligence is all about. Now, obviously, as we move through evolutionary stages in terms of the density of our Maya relative to our form, as we move along in those stages, it is necessary for us to find strategies that are more than just staying alive, more than just a cave that you can back into at night and protect yourself in, more than the simple strategy of how you bring down and kill a beast that is faster and more dangerous than you are physically. These basic strategies are at the very root of our process, and yet they are truly mundane. And to really understand how mundane humanity is within the context of the not-self is to understand that the basic strategic level of intelligence is where most human beings are still occupied. Most human beings are still occupied with the basic material demands. And it isn't so much whether the three of you can get together and manage to bang something over the head hard enough so that you can, have it for dinner. It's whether the three of you can work hard enough to sell a product so that you make enough money so you can have your dinner, but it's still the same game. And the highest level of intelligence is to find a strategy that simply goes beyond survival. This is inherent in the 28th gate. That is, it's inherent in the process of the 2838, to struggle to find a purpose that is beyond simply survival. And so, one of the things to really grasp is this very profound and very deep law within the 50th gate, that, the true strategy, the ultimate strategy, is an awareness strategy. It's an awareness strategy that goes far beyond the physical and mundane strategy. And that if you do not follow the strategy, you are not going to live at the mundane level. You're simply going to die, because you're not going to be able to look after yourself. And at the awareness level, your spirit dies. That is, if you do not find within your intelligence the strategy that is correct for the survival and the growth and beauty of the potential of your awareness, then it just becomes a deadened thing. And of course you can see that in the vast majority of the not-self, that life basically is an unpleasant experience where, one is constantly struggling with the forces of the mundane plane. And most human beings, because they don't operate correctly, it's not possible for them to have a productive relationship with the material plane and still be able to fulfill what is the law. And the law is that you're not simply here to be aware, to be alive. You're here to discover awareness in this life. The whole principle of what we call existence is this vast evolutionary experiment in, seeing whether consciousness can operate in form. When you go to the other side of the 50th gate and, what you are really looking at is the whole necessity, if you will, to understand something that, and I'm speaking of the third gate, difficulty of the beginning, the most profound generative gate of mutation, and to recognize that, as the first line expresses, that mutation is a natural thing that ultimately can be overcome. But what it's really referring to is the fact that it's there and it's not there. Or better, it's not there, it's not there, it's not there. Oops, it's there. What do we do? And it's one of the first things that I truly understood about the mystical process, is that the traditional concepts of karma, the kinds of concepts of karma that exist in Eastern philosophies, that the fact is that it's, well, I don't want to be too rude, but it's a lot of junk. The reality is that there is no path. There is no path. You can be living out your design and operating correctly as yourself, and the fact is that you may, in fact, experience a level of awareness that others do not, and be able to move without, the implications of resistance in your life. But that doesn't mean that you're going to have a profound mystical event. It doesn't mean that suddenly there is going to be this extraordinary satori. It doesn't mean any of that, because that is a mutative process. So it's not there until it's there. So there is no way to plan for it. There is no way to expect it. There is no point in asking for it. None whatsoever. This is the law, and the law is mutation. Change only takes place, true change only takes place through the agency of mutation. And mutation is not something that can be predicted in that sense. It's not something where, you can say, all right, all I have to do is the next 25 mantras, and sure enough, there it's going to be. It doesn't work that way. The one I like the best is the 56th gate. The Wanderer, this gate of stimulation. And there's two gates of magic. There's the 48th gate. This is the gate of black magic. And there's the 11th gate, and this is the gate of white magic. And by the way, those terms can easily be confused with popular perceptions of that. What I mean by black magic is form magic, and what I mean by white magic is spirit magic, and they're very different things. And the 56th gate is the potential to express magic. As a matter of fact, both gates of magic have this potential for expression. Both of them are projected elements. Both of them have this capacity for recognition. But the thing that is so beautiful about the law of the 56 is that the very experience of magic literally can make believers of us all. And it is this very power of the magic of the Spirit to be expressed that creates so many believers. Think about any of the major faiths in the world, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, any of these belief systems where there is this inherent belief in some, unknowable, all-powerful, omnipotent force that is out there that somehow is in charge at some level or another of the whole life phenomena. Now, this is the law of the stimulation of the spirit. And when the spirit is stimulated, you end up with believers. It's just, a mechanism that is there. And again, these mechanisms, in terms of spirituality or mysticism, these are laws that are operating at a very high level. Not everybody gets access to that, in a sense. Most people get the step-down version of it. So the 56th gate can be as much about the establishment of vast levels of gullibility, as Marx so cleverly stated that religion is the opiate of the masses. All of those things are possible out of that 56 gate. But the interesting thing about it is that the very expression of it leads to believing. And it's something that I had to confront in my own process in dealing with a logical system. And looking out from my perspective back in 1987 when all of this began for me, looking out from the perspective of what was the emerging new age, all I saw all around me were new variations on old belief systems. And I realized how easy it was to get people to believe in things and how difficult it was to get people to accept logic. There is no magic in that sense in the 1762. It doesn't have that ability. The ability to express opinion doesn't automatically lead to the acceptance of understanding. It doesn't. But the expression of the spirit out of the 11, moving through the 56, out of that 56, it automatically creates these believers. It's quite something to grasp that it's been one of the essential ingredients in terms of, the way in which humanity is oriented, that, they're basically, and this is all not self-programming, suckered into this kind of automatic kowtowing to, somebody saying that, this is something to believe in. Here, believe in this, and it'll make you free. I think that's one of the pat phrases. And finally we have the 60th gate, and we have the real understanding of the nature of limitation. And this is the ultimate law. And it's the most beautiful of the laws. And of course with the third gate it forms a definition, so you have this whole mutative process. And it's something so deeply to understand that magic appears out of nowhere, and that no one is a magician. Don't ever believe that anyone is a magician. Magic moves through beings. Nobody gets to possess it. Some people are beautiful vessels for it. It is one of the first mystical lessons that I had. It was the very beginning of my disappearance. I disappeared in 1983 and ended up here in the island of Ibiza. And I think it was the second day that I was on the island. I had been given a place to stay by a local painter. And I was actually staying in John Hurt's house, the actor, I guess most famous for Elephant Man, if of all things. You wouldn't recognize his face, but anyway. John was always away somewhere making a movie or at his place in Africa, and he had given over his house to a local painter called Roger Dixon, a very, very actually interesting painter, because for me he was sort of the last of the Impressionists. His paintings looked a little bit like Bonnard. They were quite something, but they were all of Ibiza, the Ibiza landscape. It made for interesting work, and I can remember being in his studio. He was preparing for a show, and he had converted the living room of the house into a working place, and there were canvases everywhere. And I had been sleeping on the roof, and was not used to that. And I was very cold and damp when I got up in the morning, and I came down into the house, and he was out somewhere. And I went over. There was an armoire in the room, and I went over to this armoire. It had a glass mirrored door, and the mirrored door was sort of partially open, and hanging over that door was a longi. A longi is a kind of it's a rectangular cloth that is common in Asia. You wrap it around your waist. It's very common to wear it in Ibiza in the summertime, men or women. And there was this longi hanging over the mirror, and I wanted to look at myself in the mirror. I wanted to see if I looked as bad as I felt. And that was the first time that I would really experience magic. The longi was in the way of my view, and I watched. I had never known such a thing. I watched my hands go up and grab this thing. And when I say I watched them, I don't know how to describe that kind of disconnect that I learnt afterwards was very much a part of the entry into a mystical experience. I've had a lot of events, and they almost all began with the same kind of feeling. There's a stuffing of the ears, sort of like what you get in an airplane when the pressure drops, except it's not as strong, but it's still it's evident that the acoustic quality around you has somehow been dampened. At least that's my experience. And then there is this. It's almost like the ability of the passenger to even identify with the vehicle is somehow isolated. You know, it's like my image of the passenger riding in the back seat of the limo, and you know, many of these limos, they have a kind of intercom communication between the back seat and the driver, and you know, this is one of those moments where suddenly that communication seems to be cut off. And basically I watched as, you know, my hands grabbed this longi and slid along the side. I watched them snap it up into the air and pull it over my head. The whole motion, the whole action, was the kind of thing that you could only do that if you had done that many times. There was a certain familiarity and perfection to an act that I had never knowingly committed in my life. And it was an extraordinary thing. You know, suddenly the body was doing something all on its own. I mean, all on its own. It was amazing to watch it. You know, I mean, at some point, because it lasted for maybe 3 to 4 minutes, there was some point inside of that where, you know, I tried to find my body again and could not. I was just watching. This is this mutative woof, and that you suddenly realize that this is not about you being something. This is about something happening to you. Everything about the nature of being is so deeply to recognize that it is all simply happening. It's just happening. Nothing worse than the vanity of human beings who claim that they control or own such things. They do not. They do not. Nobody does. You know, for me, magic is like any other art form. You know, to be a creative artist is to understand that the art is the inspiration and you are the medium. I mean, you're only a medium. And every creative artist knows that there are times when you do not function well as a medium. You know, there are times when it's not there. The inspiration isn't there. It's just not. You know, it's not like I can sit down and decide to write a piece of music. It's something that happens to me. It's not something I do. I mean, it's the closest I came to any kind of mystical recognition when I was young. You know, was the wonder at where the music came from, because I didn't understand where it was coming from. I've been writing music, or it's been writing me all my life. And of course, this is the same thing with magic. You know, magic is something that moves through us like love moves through us, like anything moves through us. And it is about how good a vessel you are. You know? I mean, and that isn't up to you. No choice, said the voice. It isn't up to you. Some of us are the right instrument for the right frequency. You know, I never ask, why was it me? You know, Why did this happen to me? I was just the right vessel for the frequency, for whatever reason. I mean, there is no reason. It doesn't have to be a reason. And this is one of the deepest protections, that one can have the moment that one enters into realms that are not mundane, is to see very clearly that you can only go to such places as a helpless being. You can't go any other way. You cannot go with vanity. You cannot go with a sense that you are in control. You cannot even go with the sense that you're going to come back. You can't. You can't. So the cross of the laws today. The dog and the camel. There must be something very extraordinary about these two creatures. I don't know much about camels. I do understand their mythology within the desert, and their mythology is extraordinary. I'm a great dog lover, and I've had the good fortune in my life to raise a wolf, and I lived here in Ibiza with a totally wild dog. They're extraordinary creatures, and I have never truly speculated on why this is the name of these objects and what relationship the name of these objects have to the concretized forms that we relate to these names. I just don't know. But it's clear to me that obviously there is something in all of that. One of the most interesting parts of my own process is the understanding that so many of the things that I share in my whatever my teaching spectrum is going to be in my life, there's so much research that ultimately will have to be done. There are so many things that there is simply not enough time to look into, nor is there the specialized interest in that sense to look into it. But anyway, today we're going to deal with the camel. How A got leave an ox to be. No camel, quoth the Jews, like G. Oh, I do love that. That's from Robert Browning. Robert Browning, very famous English poet. And I don't know when it was. It was in the early 80s, and I was reading something of Blavatsky's, and Helena Blavatsky. I loved her because she was a chain smoker. I do love witches. And she had made some kind of a comment that the most mystical dream that any human being ever had, which is quite a statement, she said was Robert Browning's, and that nobody has ever understood it. And so I went looking for this dream, and Browning indeed, he had some kind of a mystical dream, but all that he woke up with a kind of a memory, and the only memory that stayed with him was a mantra. And the mantra to him made no sense, and it made no sense to all of those who tried to interpret it. How A got leave an ox to be. No camel, quoth the Jews, like G. You have that written in one of the earlier plates. The camel's really something. In my early grade courses, I realized that introducing the camel was immediately a problem because my students began to go squirrely because they started to try to figure out what the camel really does. And that's quite an exercise in awareness and patience. But anyway, okay. Again, with these plates for the illustrations tonight, I've adapted them so I've isolated the camel from the most of the dog information, because when I wrote these plates, I put them together. At that time, I didn't speculate on the fact that I would teach them in cosmology. All right, the band had lost love and found form. Out of form, the design crystal is dormant. In form, it builds. The center sits at the heart of the sun, and filters the string. Now think about that. The center sits at the heart of the sun, but it doesn't create the string. And remember, whenever I'm speaking of string, I am speaking of neutrino information. So the center sits in the sun, but it doesn't filter it filters the neutrino stream, but it's not the source of it. At source, building, maintaining, and informing the sun's solar body. So the neutrino stream that goes through the center crystal, that what that leads to is that is the building. That's how it builds the body of the solar system. Now think about that in relationship to your own design crystal. You know, your design crystal that is in the first, let's say, 2 trimesters of a normal pregnancy, it's your design crystal that is building the form. It's building the vehicle. So one of the things to understand at this level is to recognize that as the neutrino stream is filtered by the center crystal, what that's actually doing is building the solar system. So that was the first thing it did. And it's this at source, building, maintaining, and informing the sun's solar body. So it built it. You know, that's the first thing it did. It maintains it. It keeps it alive in that sense. And it informs it. It provides it with instruction. So this is what we understand specifically as the daily program. You know, when I'm doing a neutrino forecast and I'm talking about the imprint of the sun, I'm actually talking about the imprint of the center crystal. In other words, this is what's really directing the way in which the solar body operates, and of course we are very much part of that body. To a rave, this is the solar system. Okay. The camel and the dog also dwell within the rave sun. So here we have a trinity. And again, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, wherever you're going to go, whatever mythology you're going to look to, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and so forth and so on, you're going to find all of these various trinities that are all there. And of course we have this fundamental trinity. This is where our Godhead is. This is the Godhead. It's always been the Godhead. The sun's always been worshipped one way or another. The sun is life. Consciousness has always been aware of that. It is life. And here lies the most profound Godhead that we have. In other words, this combination of center, camel, and dog. So the camel and the dog, they also dwell within the rave sun. They each incarnate once every approximate 19,000 years. Never in the form of raves. The dog manifests and maintains the body and life of the sun itself. It is the dog that generates the string. So here you're dealing with the second aspect of the way in which our solar source operates. In other words, it's the dog that is actually maintaining the sun itself. It has nothing to do, in that sense, with the rest of us. Its focus, and its only focus, is to maintain the power of the sun, or the fusion process of the sun, which is its life process. And it's the dog that generates the string. In other words, this is the source of the neutrino information. Now remember, that neutrino information that is coming out of the dog, that neutrino information is then going to be filtered by the center. And out of that filtering is the programming that's going to be there for the solar system. Okay, so we come to the camel. And the camel also filters string. So the camel is similar in some ways to the center. In other words, if you're really looking at the heart of the Trinity, you get the dog. And I don't mean to do any elaborate jokes on dog backwards, but, if you look at the heart of this Trinity, what you're looking at is the dog, because the dog's actually creating the neutrino information. It's actually creating the consciousness information. It's actually the source of the program itself. Remember, we looked last time and we saw that there is going to be a very strange event late in this century when the dog finally incarnates for this round. Now think about what that means. It means that the sun is suddenly going to be destabilized. And it also means that the programming information is going to stop. From the sun. For as long as the dog, is in form. Now we know that it does not ever enter into, a form that is going to be around for a long time. And we know that it's never going to be in a rave. But nonetheless, there is really going to be a very powerful solar disturbance when that takes place. Our sun is entering into its middle age. Where the sun itself, from the terms of astronomy, when you're looking at the sun, you're looking at a class M star. It's rather kind of ho hum. It's not in anything particularly interesting. It's a common kind of star, has a basic lifespan. It'll eventually just slowly expand and eat up the whole solar system some couple of billion years from now. But the thing to keep in mind is that this life process of the sun, this is the dog's work, and when the dog is going to incarnate on Earth, the sun is going to have its midlife crisis, and everything on Earth is going to have to deal with that midlife crisis. I have no idea. It may be so tiny that it doesn't necessarily really disturb. Perhaps the camel incarnates into a microbe with a lifespan of 18 seconds. I have no idea. My assumption is, my logic says to me that if it's going to be longer than 10 or 15 minutes, then it's going to have a very disturbing impact on the planet. Okay, but let's get to the camel. The camel also filters the string. So again, its duality, its polarity with the way in which the sun works. And of course, what do we see? The center works, and we see that the center is informing the whole solar system. What does the camel do exactly? The camel and the dog can be stationary, but the camel never stops moving. It never stops moving. And why it's moving, this is something that is really very interesting. And the reason that it's moving is that it's tracking something. It's tracking it. The camel filters string. The center of the dog can be stationary. The camel never stops moving. Its rotation within the sun is exactly synchronized to the motion of the rave planet called Mercury. Now think about that. In other words, what you're looking at is that the camel has a rotation. And the camel has a rotation. In essence, it is constantly moving around the dog. It is circling it, if you will. And it's circling it precisely in the same synchronized movement as Mercury. So there is a specific relationship, a very important specific relationship between the camel and Mercury. Now, what is Mercury? If we're looking at the mythology of Mercury, obviously Mercury is the planet that is closest to the sun. It is not very big. Titan, the great moon of Saturn, is bigger. It is baked to the bone. If you can imagine the intensity of what Mercury deals with within the intensity of the solar winds and its proximity to the sun, it's a fiery hot place. It's beautiful to see when you get a chance to see Mercury in the sky, which is not necessarily easy because it's very close to the sun. Sunset, sunrise is actually the best. It's incredible to see how beautiful it is and how it sparkles in the sky. But the mythology of Mercury, this is the planet that most loves man. This is Prometheus, this is the great gift of the gods to humanity. It is this kind of the communicator in the mercurial sense, the messenger of the gods, passing all of this information on, this essential information to humanity. And so often, these gods that offer knowledge to humanity, how they are punished by the gods. Punished for giving the information, the knowledge to man. And so Mercury as a planet is very, very special. And it's special in the sense that, it truly, if you can anthropomorphize that, it is the planet that most cares about us and most cares about our evolution, our evolutionary development. Every 88 days. I love those numbers, 88, how sweet. Every 88 days the camel and Mercury complete a cycle. That would be nice if it was spelt properly. This is an evolutionary sequence. Think about that. Every 88 days, the camel and Mercury complete a cycle around the sun. That's Mercury's, what a mercurial year is 88 days. And so every 88 days we have the completion of what is a sequence. This is an evolutionary sequence. And the evolutionary sequence, the center, can never directly inform Mercury. So not only do we have the fact that the camel rotates around the dog, but the camel also rotates around, in that sense, the center. In other words, that it blocks the ability of the center to directly inform Mercury. The string filtered by the center is then filtered by the camel before it can inform Mercury. Now think about that. The center filters the neutrino information and spreads that information out to the whole solar system. But in terms of its impact on one object, it never directly impacts Mercury. Never. Everything else, but not Mercury. Now isn't that interesting? It's quite something to think about. Mercury has a very special place. If you go back to the oldest mystical writings about the planets, Mercury is considered to be the Sun's older brother. Now that's really old stuff. But there is something in it that is very, very essential to grasp. That Mercury has a very special relationship in that sense. And a relationship with the Sun that almost places it as, a kind of equal in a way. And what is it that the camel and Mercury are actually doing? What are they doing? See, let me finish the plate before I take my thoughts any further. Where the function of the dog is general, the function of the camel is specific. The filtration of the string by the camel is experienced by raves as their personality consciousness. How about that? See, Mercury is really something, and so is the camel. See, the way in which our personality consciousness is programmed is controlled by this configuration. Now, it's all coming from the Sun, and when I'm doing the neutrino forecast, I'm not telling people this is what they're getting from the camel, because I don't really think that it makes any difference. It's like talking about the Saturnian energy field and realizing that you're talking about the Titans and you're talking about all their moons. We're getting a field of energy from these objects that we just give a name to. But this very special relationship between the camel and Mercury is something extraordinary. And it led to something. When I was given the knowledge, obviously I was given a synthesis of many different disciplines. And one discipline that I was told about, I was instructed never to include in the synthesis. that it had no place in it. And so I never did. And what I'm referring to is the tarot. When I began my mystical life on the island, I met so many different kinds of expressions of the New Age. And I met all kinds of people who were, astrologers and tarot card readers and tea leaf readers and you name it, whatever you want to read or can read, palm readers and head readers and readers of readers of readers. But the tarot was interesting. I mean, it was interesting because I love the visual. And particularly the very old tarots, the original ones that are about 300 years old, the drawings are very special. But the tradition of the tarot was all messed up. And the reason that I was not able to incorporate it into the synthesis was that the knowledge had been so corrupted that the derivative information that people have today from it simply didn't work anymore. And it was a corruption that went back in a very odd way. Sequencing belonged to the Egyptian priesthood. And sequencing became a magical concept in very early mystical Jewish thought. There was obviously a famous convergence of those two societies, the whole Moses story and all of these things. Levels or qualities of the sequencing principle then became part of what was Kabbalah, and Kabbalah is mystical interpretation of the 5 books of the law, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the books of Moses, not of the right from the beginning, after Genesis, the books of the law. And this mystical interpretation of the 5 books of the law, known as Kabbalah, emerged in Cordoba, of all places, in the south of Spain. Cordoba was one of the great cities of the world at the height of Moorish power. And Cordoba was a cosmopolitan city that housed both some of the most beautiful Islamic architecture that the world's ever seen, along with Christianity and Judaism, and it was a place where everybody lived rather peacefully in a kind of intellectually stimulating environment. And it was here that Kabbalah was translated for the first time into Latin, and that Latin translation was then translated ultimately into French, and that French translation was then interpreted into what became known as the tarot. That's a very long, broken telephone. What I was told was that sequencing was something that was understood probably 4,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago, by the Egyptians. And everything about this sequencing is about this 88-day program. And this 88-day program begins before the life. It begins before the life. And so it makes it exceedingly difficult to see the sequencing on the surface. It is very, very deep knowledge, actually, and who knows, maybe one day there are going to be those that will get into the exploration of it. So let's go back for a moment, and I want to make sure that you've got this whole picture. We have this trinity that is there within the sun. Each of them have a specific task in that sense. And the reality is that all of those aspects have the potential to directly influence life on this planet. That all of them represent the programming principle that we call the imprint. 70% of the neutrinos we receive from our sun. So we know that at the core of this, that we have the dog, and we know that the dog is the source of the neutrino information itself. It is the source of, and is the maintainer of, the very vitality of the sun. Next to that dog is the center. And the center is filtering that neutrino information and filtering it for the maintenance of the solar system and the information that the solar system needs to continue its process as a physical form. In other words, the life of the solar body in that sense. And then finally we have the camel. And the camel is very, very specific. It's always moving. It's always moving in relationship to Mercury. So as Mercury is moving in its orbit, there's the camel that is following the orbit, always providing the neutrino information specifically to Mercury. Now remember, the drawing is misleading. It does not mean that the neutrino information going to Mercury stops here. It does not, obviously. It would take even a wall that is 1,000 light years thick, made of lead, isn't going to slow down a neutrino. So the neutrino information that is coming out of the camel specifically and going through Mercury and being impacted by Mercury, it's Mercury after all that has the gift of being able to communicate to humanity. That's its job, is to communicate to humanity. And you see, all the sun gods, all of them, the Apollos and the Ra's and whatever, all of them are this relationship that humanity has to the camel. It is the camel that represents this very, very specific communicating of the gods through Mercury to the rest of us, and specifically, to us on Earth. Obviously, this is all part of the way in which, this program is operating. But in being able to do cosmology, it gives me an opportunity to change, as you will see, our perception about the planets and the way that the planets work, because these planets, they all have very, very specific things that they're responsible for in the way in which the solar body operates, like organs in a body as an example. And for us to begin to see the power of what Mercury is. The power of Mercury. How extraordinary it is. But more than that, the camel has a specific relationship to the human personality crystal. It has a specific relationship to the personality crystal. So when you're looking at the influence of the camel and Mercury on the development of consciousness, it begins with your design calculation. That is, it begins the moment that the personality crystal enters into the vehicle. And from the moment that the personality enters into the vehicle, that's the moment that the programming of the camel through Mercury is specifically influencing that personality crystal and specifically programming that crystal. And when you think about it this way, it is only when the child truly leaves the vehicle that it experiences the totality of programming. And it's not that it doesn't get that in, for example, the first 2 trimesters, where there is no personality crystal, where its matrix is impacted by the generalized program in that sense. But the moment that you enter into the final trimester, or the final 88 degrees of the sun, it's not so much that the activations are not possible in their matrix from the transiting program, but it's like you can imagine all the planets are playing music, but they're all playing music at a rather low level, and Mercury is blaring away with a trumpet. And basically the only thing that's really being felt at a deep level is this very loud trumpet that's overwhelming everything else. And you see the whole mystery of sequencing. Why subsequent generations, because the knowledge was lost, subsequent generations unable to understand how the sequence works, so that there is no way for the present tarot to look at that tarot and to be able to use it as a sequencing tool. As an example, everything that happens along a fractal geometry is aligned to sequencing. Everything. Human beings there's 88 potential sequences. And each of those 88 potential sequences, every human being on any given day is in one of those 88 sequences. And there are days when, let's say, you're in the 25th sequence and I'm in the 25th sequence. Those are days when the potential of our geometries meeting is heightened. There's all kinds of things to the sequences. And each and every one of those sequences, in the same way that you can talk about gates or whatever, they all have a nature in that sense. But the sequencing, this whole process of the sequencing, it begins when the personality crystal enters into the vehicle. And here is the magic of Mercury, because here you have truly the messenger of the gods. Truly. What I love so much about this is that, the traditional recognition of this force is so incredibly accurate. That this is in fact, the myths are right. This is a very, very special force that brings us a very specific imprint. And a specific imprint that is tailored for our personality crystals. It's tailored for them. We're not getting all of the information that the sun is putting out, in that sense, to the whole solar body. We don't need all that information. We don't need the information that Uranus is getting or Saturn is getting or whatever. That is not what it is all about. We don't need the information in that sense that the other forms of life on the planet are getting. In the generalized field of the center filtering the string. But the camel, it's only for our personality. And it can only do it, think about it this way, it can only do it through Mercury. So one of the things to be clear about is that, Mercury has a deep, deep, deep connection to what we call the incarnative process. It has to, in that sense. It is the agency of preparing personality consciousness with exactly the right information. Exactly the right information. And there's something to think about. Because in some of our lifetimes, we've already experienced the lack of this programming. One of the things that just to think about and to look at is that the images themselves, these graphics for the camel and the dog, I really think that they're quite extraordinary. When you look at the dog, and basically you're looking at a four-sided object. That four-sidedness is really one of the basic symbols of life itself. That is 4 points and the illusion of the fifth in the center. And the dog very much creates this, this concretized realm in that sense. But what I've always loved about the camel image is this pyramid that's inside of it. And everything about the nature of the camel is deeply connected to what is the triangle in that sense. And of course out of that comes the image of the rave itself, because of course this is, one forgets after looking at them for so many years that the rave body graph is simply a triangle. And it again is very much part of this programming that is coming from the camel itself. Once and around, the camel incarnates. And this is a very important event. The camel incarnated in 1936 and returned to the sun in 1941. Think about that. So from 1936 to 1941, remember that the camel nor the dog ever incarnated as raves. They were not human. That the camel incarnated in 1936, and it only returned to the sun in 1941. That's quite a juncture. And that means that all of the human beings that were born between 1936 and 1941, that all of those human beings were born without the advantage of the direct programming of the camel. It was the only opportunity for the center to directly inform Mercury since before 16,101 BC. So in that period, from 1936 to 1941, and by the way, the first thing that you can intuit from that is that the moment that the camel was no longer filtering the string for the benefit of personality consciousness, that you can see that there was an enormous instability in the way in which humanity operated. I mean, after all, this, the chaos that existed between 36 and 41, the number of millions of human beings who died between 1936 and 1941 all over the world, the kind of inhumane ways in which human beings dealt with each other all over the world in that chaos, that there was enormous chaos, and it would take years after the return of the camel for things slowly to heal from that experience. But it was also something else, and think about this in the sense that the center never has its opportunity to directly influence it never has the opportunity to directly influence Mercury. And yet in this period, and the only time since 16,000 BC, for this short period of approximately 5 years, all the children being born at that time, everyone incarnating between 1936 and 1941, they incarnated with information specifically given to them directly from the center. Now, I know, because I have these beings in my life, and some of them obviously in human design, this period there, of course they always ask me the same question, well, what in fact does that mean? From my own, I wasn't told what it meant, by the way, so I can only speak from my own speculation. My speculation is that it has to do with the mutation that's coming in 2027. I think this was the beginning of humanity being allowed to catch up to the larger mutation that was taking place on the outside. There was an extraordinary event that began to take place during that time that would have enormous meaning to the way in which our process operates. Everything has a prana. I mean, everything is a prana. Everything is, this growth, this expansion, and then ultimately deterioration, and eventually coming to an end. And whenever we're dealing with a round, we're dealing with a huge prana. So as we leave 16,000 BC behind and you get to 1936, the distance from 1936 to 2027 is nothing in that scale of going back 16,000 years and more, obviously, 18,000 years, 19,000 years into the past. So for me, it's very clear that the mutation that was taking place on the outside, because remember, this is, it's not about what's going on here, it's about what's going on everywhere. This is it, we are it, and it is us. So, it is the whole movie in the way it's operating. And this generation, this 1936 to 1941 generation, they were programmed very differently. And they were programmed to carry the information in that sense of, the whole genetic process. My assumption is that we'll probably be able to go back to this generation and see that their descendants are probably the most productive. For example, if you know anybody born in between 1936 and 1941, who has a grandchild, a blood relation of theirs that happens to be coming into the world right now, and coming in on the Cross of Eden generation theme right now, chances are 99 out of 100 that generation or the next generation is going to produce rave children. So I think it was very, very important programming, but we paid an enormous price for it in that sense. In other words, in many ways it's the metaphor for the end of humanity. You could see, how easy it is to strip away the veneer of civilization and simply end up with the killing ground. And the madness that arose the moment that the camel, left the sun and stopped its deep humanistic programming of humanity. I mean, it is the benefit, for me, when I look at the camel, I look at, what is the civilizing agent, if you will. This is the thing that keeps humanity civilized. And it's obvious to me that the fact that it was gone in those years, this was the chaos created, and it would take time in that sense, to be able to bring things back to some kind of a balance. But in fact, what we're really looking at is that from the larger perspective of, the global programming, this was a moment for humanity, to be brought into the process itself. All right, it was the only opportunity for the center to directly inform Mercury. This planet has a special function. From the moment that a personality crystal enters into the body of a rave fetus, for 88 days, it will only respond to the programming of this planet. And again, what that really means is this is the loudest. After all, you still don't have a functional being at that point. But it's very important to understand how specific this is and how difficult it is to do sequencing without very sophisticated programming. I mean, there is a difference between 88 degrees of the sun and 88 days. Now, it's not much, but it adds up. I mean, it's one of the most interesting things about sequencing is that sequencing is directly related to, I've talked about this in the stages of development in the first 88 degrees, about the importance of serotonin and the whole theme of time, that there is every vehicle comes with a basic longevity potential, and obviously there are other factors, so there are many things that can change that. But in terms of what the guarantee on the vehicle is itself, is the amount of serotonin that is going to be produced in the lifetime. And that amount of serotonin is based on sequences. In other words, there's a specific amount of serotonin that's produced for each complete sequence of 88 days. And the number of sequences that you're going to have in your life was one of the things that the ancient Egyptians actually knew. Which is why they were able to write a Book of the Dead long before anybody could really deeply contemplate what that was all about. They knew that there were sequences. Those of you, there are few of you here, I think, who have either were at my death course or have taken it since then, in Channel 88, to really understand the Bardo stages, where you get to see the completion of the whole sequencing process. There's a sequence coming in, there's a sequence going out, and these sequences in a lifetime, I mean, approximately you go through approximately 4 sequences a year, approximately. So you're in a lifetime, and the lifetime then, and again, this is something that is also very interesting, is that there is a very profound connection between Mercury and Saturn, though it isn't a deep aspect of my I don't really want to get into a lot about that tonight, but there is a very strong relationship between the two, and most of that relationship is the fact that this knowledge was exceedingly valuable in the Saturnian life. And that Saturnian life, basically this is where there was within the 28 plus whatever years of the Saturnian cycle. Here's where the original sequences were measured out, and it was used as a way of trying to be able to understand how to connect forces to create great forces. It's like the chambers that were built into pyramids. Those chambers were built for the release of certain frequencies, and the release of certain frequencies that were based on all the participants who were operating within that complex were all in sequence. Sequencing has when people are brought together in a sequence, there is a quality of harmony that is, it is quite something, and there is a bond that is there with the other that you don't really experience through anything else. And of course, we give it other names and whatever the case may be. But the fact is that following the sequencing itself is a very complex calculation. And the other thing is that each of the 88 sequences, most of this information, most of it is lost. What I have is I have a way of sort of maybe interpreting them, and I've never actually worked with it. One of the strangest things that I was given by the voice, it's still one of the strangest things, and I still have difficulty dealing with it, is that I was given a six, how can I describe them? I was given 6 glyphs, and those 6 glyphs relate to every letter of every alphabet and every number. As I said, it's quite a thing. And one of the things that I do know about those glyphs, because in the very early years, particularly when I was still deeply isolated so that I could indulge in my particular form of madness, I experimented with using these glyphs to look at things, to try to translate letters and numbers into the glyphs themselves, to try to understand the way in which it operates. And it's through these glyphs that it's possible to read the sequence itself. However, I've never done so. Other than, I think in the early Grey courses I showed people the sequencing that I had done for myself for my first Saturn cycle, because I was just, curious to see the various points, each of those 88 points, and what they possibly could mean. And I would look at the timing, and I would look at the design for that timing, and I tried to get some sense of all of that. But then I went back to what the voice told me. This was not a part of the synthesis. It was not going to be of any value to a human being on the surface. However, it doesn't mean that it isn't, in many ways, not only deeply mysterious but very significant. There is no question that the agency of the camel is everything about what we think of as the quality of human consciousness. And the programming of the camel is so extraordinary. And its relationship to Mercury. And every time now that you look at Mercury in the transiting wheel, to really think behind Mercury lies this camel. doing its job, civilizing us in that sense, making us different in that sense from everything else. I mean, the most interesting thing to realize about that period of 1936 to 1941 is that we were reduced to being mammals. I mean, the fact that we lost our civilizing agent, because the center is not a civilizing agent in that sense. It is a general programming agent for the solar life, for the life of the solar body, but it isn't specifically geared to humanity. As a matter of fact, the center is programming the dog that's in my house, but it is not programming directly anybody else. Whereas the camel is programming everyone in the house, but it isn't programming the dog. So the moment that you take the camel away, the moment the camel incarnated, for that period of time, the fact was that humanity in many ways was reduced to its mammalian nature, and I think that all of us will agree, given what history tells us, that that's exactly what happened. That whole veneer of civilization was simply stripped away in a moment. So obviously these sequences are very significant in that sense, that they are steps, a repeated cyclical process that is somewhat akin to what I teach reflectors about, obeying the law of the moon. You wait your 28 days, go through the lunar cycle, and when you get to the lunar cycle, at the end of the lunar cycle, you have the completion of the cycle, and then you can have the awareness that goes with it. And it really is very much the same thing in terms of the camel mercurial, sequence, is that it is no particular step in the sequence that really matters. It is all the steps in the sequence as the sequence completes. And it is the accumulation of sequences, that leads to this movement. And you can see that sequencing ended up being, transformed into, all of these mystical cults that initiated people to different levels. We're going to initiate you to level 1, level 2, level 3. Sounds like IHDS teachers trainings, It is just the way that whole process works. For me anyway, one of the most fantastic things, in all the planetary knowledge, is this business of the camel and Mercury. I'm a great fan of Mercury. I have a statue of Mercury that stands over me on a shelf and looks down at me with its wings on its heels. The messages of the gods are the greatest gifts. I don't want to, as much as I love my dog, I don't want to be reduced to that level of consciousness. And it's an extraordinary thing that there is this crystal. It's just a crystal, it's like a crystal that's in you or me. There is this crystal that specifically hones all of this vast neutrino information, focuses this information, and points it directly at us. It's like all of these stories about what came out of the top of the pyramids. You must know these stories. My favorite is the one about the pyramids being covered in gold. There's a great mythology based on that. Supposedly the armies of Solomon stripped the gold from the pyramids, but it's just one of those stories. But nonetheless, what's interesting about that story is that gold's a very, very heavy element. And let me give you an example. Let's say that you've got a number of beings that are inside of this pyramid, and they're in the pyramid in various chambers at different levels in the structure, and all of them are in a single sequence, and all of them are releasing specific sounds. Now, each of them has a sound, but they don't know the sequence. In other words, this would have been controlled by some kind of high priest, and each of the ones that were involved, they would have what they would have to do. They would not know, for example, the timing or the way in which the others would release the tones. Now, if you're inside here and you're releasing the sound, now the frequency itself is going to go up the top. However, instead of going straight up, because the sides of the temple, supposedly the sides of the pyramid, were gold, and gold is a heavy element, what would actually happen is that as the sound would be coming up, the protons, they would actually be pulled. And so what you would get is that instead of just going straight up, you would get this spiraling effect, and because it's acoustic and it's a sound wave, that the wave would go further and further and further and further and further. There's some people who speculate that the way in which the concept of pyramid spread all over the world was it spread in that way. The other thing is, how interesting to imagine, if you like to imagine these things, how do you keep a couple of 100,000 slaves happy hauling enormous blocks and stuff like that? Because it certainly wasn't done with magical instruments. However, there, the ability to acoustically impact, hypnotize, to deeply affect others tonally, this was something that is very much a part of this image. And what I like most of all is this focus of the camel. It's almost an arrowhead in a sense. It is pointed directly at us. It is only for us. And the other wonderful mystery, because I don't know, and I guess we'll never know, is what did it do for those 5 years? I mean, where was it? And what was it? Now, 5 years is a long time. It eliminates an awful lot of life forms. So, it's something to really think about. Maybe it comes as a camel. Who knows? I have no idea. Maybe it does. Maybe the dog, when it incarnates in 84, will come as a dog and hopefully get quickly hit by a car, so that we don't have the complete breakdown of the way in which the sun operates. But the camel, this is one of my real favorites. I think this is an extraordinary thing. How we got leave and ox to be? Well, there's no camel, quoth the Jews like G.